The sun has set over the 7 hills, and the roar of the wedding feast is finally dying down. Outside, the streets of Rome are still alive with the smell of roasted meat and the sound of guests singing Thalasio to the gods. But inside the dark hallway of the groom's house, the air is cold. A young bride stands at the threshold. Her head is covered by a flame-colored veil, her body wrapped in a white wool tunic. She has just been carried over the doorway to avoid any bad luck. But the real challenge isn't luck, it's the law. In ancient Rome, a marriage isn't just a promise, it is a contract that must be sealed with physical proof. Tonight, behind closed doors, ancient medical secrets and legal requirements will collide in a ritual that history tried to hide. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The room was lit only by the flickering flame of a single oil lamp. The walls, painted in deep earthy reds and ochres, seemed to move in the dancing shadows. For Julia, the daughter of a senator, the wedding had been a blur of bright colors and loud voices. She had worn the flammeum, the bright orange veil, all day. It was heavy, and it felt like a mask hiding her fear from the hundreds of guests who had come to watch her father trade her hand for a political alliance. Now, the guests were gone. The musicians had packed their lyres. The laughter of her bridesmaids still echoed in her ears, but it felt miles away. She sat on the edge of the high, wooden bed. The Roman bed was not a place of comfort. It was a stage for a legal performance. In the corner of the room, an older woman, the pronuba, a matron who had only been married once, stood silently. Her job was to prepare the bride, to whisper the secrets of the night, and to ensure that the ancient customs were followed to the letter. But the secrets she whispered were not about happiness. They were about endurance. Ancient Roman writers like Ovid and Catullus wrote beautiful poems about the sweetness of the wedding night, but the medical texts told a different story. Some doctors believed that a bride should be unaware during this transition. They suggested herbal drinks and heavy wines, meant to cloud the mind and numb the senses. As Julia felt the cool marble floor beneath her feet, she realized that her role tonight was not to be a partner, but to be a witness to her own life's new chapter. The law of Rome was clear. A marriage was not legally finished until the consummation occurred. If there was no proof of what happened in this room, the dowry could be returned, the alliance could break, and the family's honor could vanish like smoke in the wind. Julia looked at the heavy door. She could hear the muffled footsteps of the guards and family members waiting in the hallway. They weren't there for protection, they were there for the evidence. The silence in the room was heavy. The scent of lavender and old wood filled the air, but it couldn't mask the smell of the iron-wicked lamp. Julia reached up and slowly pulled back the veil. The joy of the wedding was officially over. The ritual of the shadows was about to begin. In the dim light of the bridal chamber, known as the thalamus, the air grew thick with the smell of burnt herbs and stale wine. The pronuba, the older matron who had stayed behind, moved toward a small bronze table. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like a priestess performing a sacrifice. On the table sat a silver cup filled with a dark, cloudy liquid. "Drink this, child," the woman whispered. Her voice was dry, like old parchment. "It is the gift of the doctors. It will make the transition easier. It will make the night pass like a dream." Julia looked at the cup. She knew what was inside. While the public poets sang of the goddess Venus and the sweet sting of love, the private medical texts of the time told a darker truth. Physicians like Serenus wrote about the hysterical nature of young women. To the Roman mind, a bride's fear was something to be managed, not comforted. The drink was likely a mixture of heavy, unwatered wine and herbs like mandrake or poppy, substances meant to dull the mind and heavy the limbs. The goal was simple. The bride was to be unaware. If she were unconscious or in a deep, drug-induced sleep, she could not resist. She could not complicate the legal requirements of the night. In the eyes of the Roman law, her consent was already given by her father when the contract was signed. Her physical presence was all that was needed now. Julia took the cup. The liquid was bitter, stinging the back of her throat. As she drank, she felt a slow warmth spreading through her chest, but it wasn't a comforting warmth. It felt like a weight, pulling her down into the cushions of the bed. The edges of the room began to blur. The deep red paintings of dancing nymphs on the walls seemed to slow their movements. The pronuba began to untie the nodus herculaneus, the knot of Hercules, that fastened Julia's white wool tunic. This was a specific, ancient knot that only the husband was supposed to untie. It was a symbol of his victory and his ownership. But as the matron worked the threads, Julia felt less like a person and more like a package being unwrapped. Outside the door, she could hear the muffled sound of the groom's voice. He was talking to his friends, laughing at a joke she couldn't quite hear. In the Roman world, the groom was expected to be bold and assertive. He was the conqueror, and she was the territory. The medicine was working now. The sounds of the house grew distant, as if they were coming from underwater. The matron leaned in close, her breath smelling of honey and vinegar. "Do not worry about the pain or the blood," she said. "The blood is the most important part. Without it, there is no marriage. Without it, you are nothing." Julia closed her eyes. The flame of the oil lamp danced behind her eyelids, a tiny spark of light in an ocean of growing darkness. She was slipping away, just as the ancient writers intended. The hidden Rome was taking over, and the girl who had laughed in the garden only yesterday was being buried under the weight of the law. The heavy oak door groaned as it swung open, letting in a sudden burst of flickering torchlight from the hallway. Marcus, the groom, stepped into the room. He was much older than Julia, a man whose face bore the faint scars of his time serving in the Roman legions. He smelled of expensive cedar oil and the strong, unwatered wine that had been flowing like a river at the banquet. His face was flushed from the heat of the celebration, and his eyes searched the shadows of the room until they landed on the bed. The pronuba bowed low. She did not speak. At this moment, her role as the guardian and guide was finished. She gathered her heavy wool shawl around her shoulders and backed out of the room, her leather sandals clicking softly against the intricate mosaic floor. As she stepped into the hall, she pulled the heavy bronze handles shut. The door closed with a deep, metallic thud that echoed through the chamber like the slamming of a tomb. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus walked slowly toward the bed, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark giant. He didn't look like a man in love. He looked like a man who had just finalized a high-stakes business deal. To the Romans, this was the conventio in manum, the literal passing of the woman from the hand of her father to the hand of her husband. Julia was no longer a member of her own family. She was now the legal property of this man. Julia felt the mattress shift and groan as he sat down beside her. The herbal drink the matron had given her was now in full effect. Her limbs felt as though they were made of lead, and her eyelids were heavy, refusing to stay open. She could see the outline of Marcus's silhouette against the red-painted walls, a flickering shape that seemed to swallow the remaining light in the room. She wanted to speak, to ask him to wait or to be gentle, but the words were trapped in her throat, drowned by the poppy and the wine. Marcus reached out and touched the fine wool of her tunic. He wasn't thinking about her fear or her silence. His mind was on the Roman code. If he failed to complete the ritual tonight, the marriage could be legally challenged in the forum. In Rome, the law was the foundation of the world. A marriage without physical consummation was nothing more than a temporary arrangement, and arrangements didn't build political dynasties or secure vast fortunes. He began to untie the final threads of her garment. The room felt colder now, despite the humid summer air outside. The only sound was the occasional pop and crackle of the oil lamp and the distant, fading cheers of the guests who were still drinking in the courtyard below. They were celebrating a union, but here, in the dark, it felt like a cold, silent transaction. Julia's mind began to drift into a gray haze. She remembered the stories her mother had told her about the goddess Juno, who protected the home, and Venus, who brought beauty to the world. But where were the goddesses now? In the medical scrolls she had once seen in her father's library, the physicians described a woman as a vessel to be managed and controlled. Tonight, she was being filled with the weight of an entire civilization's expectations. As the flame of the lamp flickered low, the shadows grew longer and more distorted. Marcus leaned closer, his breath hot against the cool air of the room. The ritual was no longer a poem or a distant tradition. It was the law of the flesh, written in the dark, far away from the eyes of the world. The room was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a chamber of observation. Outside the heavy bronze-studded door, the silence was not empty. In the long, torchlit corridor of the villa, two figures stood like statues. One was the pronuba, her face a mask of duty. The other was a representative of the groom's family, a man whose job was to ensure that no part of the legal contract was ignored. In Rome, privacy was a luxury the elite could rarely afford. Every birth, every death, and especially every marriage was a matter of state and property. They waited for the sounds that would signal the transition, the shifting of the heavy wooden frame, the sharp intake of breath, and eventually, the silence that follows a completed task. Inside, the air was suffocatingly still. Marcus moved with the practiced efficiency of a soldier. To him, this was not an act of passion, but a duty to the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. The medical texts of the time, written by men like Galen, suggested that the vessel must be conquered to be useful. There was no room for the bride's voice in this equation. Because of the drugged wine, Julia's world was a blur of red shadows and heavy limbs. She felt the coldness of the night air on her skin, but it felt as if it were happening to someone else, a girl made of marble. Suddenly, the ritual reached its most critical point. In the Roman mind, a marriage was a blood covenant. It wasn't enough to simply be together. There had to be physical evidence. The ancient writers often skipped this part in their poetry, but the legal reality was brutal. The sheets of the bridal bed were more than just fabric. They were a document. As the night wore on, the oil in the lamp began to fail. The wick hissed, sputtering in its own grease. Marcus stood up, his silhouette blocking what little light remained. He reached for a linen cloth, his movements shadowboxing against the wall. This cloth would be the most important thing he owned by morning. It was the proof that would be shown to the witnesses outside, the evidence that the girl who entered this room as a daughter had truly become a wife. If the blood was not found, the consequences were devastating. The marriage could be declared non sequitur, unfinished. The girl could be sent back to her father in shame, the dowry could be litigated for years, and the political alliance could turn into a blood feud. The pressure of centuries of Roman tradition rested on that single piece of fabric. Julia lay still, her breathing shallow and ragged. The poppy was beginning to wear off, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth and a throbbing ache in her temples. She could hear the muffled whispering of the people in the hallway. They were waiting for her life to be validated by a stain. In the hidden Rome, a woman's value was written in red, and the ink was her own. The villa was now a hive of activity. From the atrium, the sounds of servants scrubbing floors and the smell of fresh bread began to rise, signaling the start of a new Roman day. But in the bridal chamber, a different kind of transition was taking place. Julia stood up from the bed, her legs trembling slightly. She walked to a small bronze basin of water that had been left in the corner. The water was cold, but it felt sharp and honest against her skin. As she washed, she caught her reflection in a polished silver mirror on the wall. The face looking back at her was the same one she had seen yesterday, yet it felt like a stranger's. The Roman wedding was designed to be a death of the old self and a birth of the new. The girl who had played with dolls and lived under her mother's protection was gone. In her place was a woman who now held the keys to a household, yet owned nothing of herself. History books often talk about the glory of Rome, the marble columns, the undefeated legions, and the complex laws that governed half the world. But they rarely speak of the silence of the thalamus. They don't mention that the very foundation of the Roman family was built on these hidden nights of sedation and legal proof. The medical texts that suggested a bride should be unaware were not just medical advice, they were tools of control. By ensuring the bride was a passive participant, the state ensured that the transaction of marriage would never be interrupted by something as unpredictable as human emotion or refusal. Julia finished dressing, pulling a new stola over her shoulders. This was the garment of a married woman, a heavy, dignified robe that signaled her status to everyone who would see her in the forum. It was a badge of honor, but to Julia, it felt like armor. As she walked toward the door, she looked back at the room one last time. The slaves had finished their work. The bed was made, the sheets replaced with fresh, white linen that showed no trace of the night's events. The oil lamp had been cleaned and refilled, ready to be lit again for the next night. The evidence had been taken away to be verified by the elders, tucked into the family records as proof of a valid union. She stepped out into the sunlight of the peristyle garden. Her husband was there, talking to her father. They were laughing, shaking hands over a new trade agreement that the marriage had made possible. When they saw her, they stopped. Her father nodded with pride, and Marcus gave her a brief, polite smile. She was now a pillar of the community, a symbol of Roman virtue. The hidden ritual was buried now, hidden behind the classical beauty of the villa and the strict decorum of Roman life. The world would see a joyous celebration and a powerful alliance. Only the shadows of the bedroom and the silent writers of the medical scrolls knew the truth of how that power was actually sealed. Julia took her place beside her husband, her face as calm and still as the marble statues that lined the halls, as the sun rose higher over the eternal city. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.